Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Specialty Crops Risk Management webinar series. Today's webinar is the 10th and final webinar of our 10 webinar series, and we're excited to have you all joining us today. This series is funded by the North Central Extension Risk Management Center. I'm Olivia Hanlon, Education Extension Specialist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I work in the Farm, Food, and Enterprise Development Program, which works largely with specialty producers on a wide variety of education and outreach topics. Joining us today is Dr. Kathleen Delate. Dr. Dellitt is a professor of organic agriculture in the departments of agronomy and horticulture and the Extension Organic Specialist for 23 years here in Iowa. She has worked with organic producers across the U.S. and the world in developing organic systems that strive to meet the triple bottom line of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. If you have any questions for Kathleen today, please feel free to drop those in the chat box as we are moving along, and we'll make sure to get those all answered at the end. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks very much for inviting me. Happy to present on some of our research on how we mitigate risk in organic production systems. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Bob Turnbull, who's an extension coordinator with the program, and Craig Chase, who did all the economics in this research that we've done. Just some shots here of our organic research fields to give you some context of what I'll be talking about in this webinar. So just to start out and show you how much organic's growing, it's now a $55.1 billion industry in the United States, and Iowa plays a key role in that. We're among the largest organic grain producers in the US, along with Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Nebraska. In the US, there's about 320,000 acres of organic corn. Iowa has 37,000 some, and we're number one in organic corn. Soybeans, about 170,000 organic acres, and we're also number one, about 22,000 acres of organic soybeans in Iowa. And that brings a lot of value to Iowa, the Iowa economy. 38 million for corn, organic corn, and 16 million for organic soybeans. There's other organic crops that are grown in Iowa too. For example, oats. We have close to 14,000 acres, and we produce 30% of the US's organic oats. And Iowa farmers, organic farmers sales have climbed 10% over the last 3 years to close to $155 million, with corn, eggs, and milk leading organic purchases. So Iowa's organic grains are known very well around the world. So they're both processed locally and used globally. They're consumed locally. They're also consumed globally. There's a growing consumption in the US of soy products like soy milk, soy flour, tofu, and tempeh. But it's also primarily, our grains are primarily major feed sources for organic dairy, cattle, poultry, and pigs. Some other organic grains that we've worked with in our organic ag program have included flax, canola, triticale, spelt, although these small grains do better in the plains area of the Dakotas and Canada. But we still have a sizable amount of production here in Iowa. Some organic farmers are also growing sorghum, rye, buckwheat, shown here, amaranth, kamut, quinoa, kernza, barley, and hybrid rye. So there's some shots of the canola and the flax that we grow in our research fields and flax seed there. So people ask, why is organic food more expensive? And it's for these following reasons. The market entry is relatively complex, and I'll talk to you about that. Production and marketing are federally regulated by the USDA National Organic Program, and that requires an annual compliance review. Supply is limited, demand is high, buyers are often a distant source. Economies of scale are often difficult to achieve, but despite all that, consumers are willing to pay a premium price for your organic product. General organic grain market characteristics is that it's a demand-driven market. There's been consistent growth year on year, but we're very dependent on organic grains in the organic market. They go into many ingredients, and as I mentioned, primary source for organic feed for organic animals. So supply is limited. But consumers are willing to pay that extra price because of that perception of the health benefit. They want to know the origin of their food. They're worried about pesticide contamination from conventional crops. They also are concerned about environmental impacts, and they like that, as our research has shown, organic can sequester more carbon than conventional practices. And that has driven the interest by big capital like ADM, Cargill, General Mills, Curie Foods, and Danone. They're all getting into the organic market. Challenges in organic are the same for all growers. I put weather as number one. We'll be talking about that in a minute. Time, maybe more so for organic because a lot of practices require a timely response. And if you miss that window of opportunity, it can reduce your yields. Adequate resources for fertility, and I'll call that alternative fertility sources. You don't just apply synthetic nitrogen, for example, and pest management. And then finding your own markets is a bigger challenge with organic. We all know about the derecho, that inland hurricane that came wailing through August 10th with 110-mile-an-hour winds through central Iowa. It was a very devastating storm. You can see some of the downed corn in the photo here. In addition, hail fell on a lot of fields, including organic fields. Stripping soybean leaf shown here caused a lot of equipment and building damage. I love this picture from the web showing the actual shelf cloud that came with that terrifying hurricane winds that came through on August 10th. In addition to that, we suffered from a severe drought in 2020. These are where we have our on-farm sites, organic farms, and you can see several of our sites were in the most severe drought area. Some were in near severe drought area. That's our research site, Neely Canyon, down in Greenfield, Iowa. So some farms, Scott Schreiber and Jefferson, were hit with both the derecho and drought. So before the derecho, you can see the pineapple look, the curling of the leaves in the organic corn. And then when the derecho came through and knocked the corn down, fortunately, the corn was well formed at that stage. So there were lodged ears, but they were very large, and he did manage to get decent yields because he was able to adjust his combine and go through that down corn. So the difference with organic farms is you look at them as a system. So within your farm, you're going to have multiple plant, pests, and beneficial organisms interacting to benefit the whole system. And organic farms promote the agroecological principles of closed energy cycles, keeping everything on your farm flowing, biodiversity, stability of production, nutrient cycling, and biotic regulation. So you're going to have natural biological control helping you with your pest management, for example. Now, enhancing the soil food web is the main goal of all organic farms. We'll talk about that as we go along. So feeding the microorganisms that will then break down plant residue and recycle it for the next crop is critical. And it's in the organic rules that you must maintain soil quality on your organic farm. So looking at some of the restrictions in organic production, you have to have 3 years between the last application of prohibited substances, that is synthetic fertilizers or pesticides, and the harvest of your certified organic crop. You have to have segregation. You're allowed to have conventional and organic on the same farm, but you need segregation between those fields. 30 feet is a good goal. Any added amendments must be approved by the certifier, and they must be naturally based, derived from natural systems, not petroleum based. Manure, if you apply manure, which most organic farms do, it has to be composted properly according to the rules, or as we do, apply it at least 3 months before harvest for grain crops. We actually apply it more like 7 months before harvest. And then 4 months before harvest of horticultural crops. You must use organic seed. No genetically modified or transgenic seed or transplants are allowed. And no treated seeds. So you can only use untreated, non-GMO seeds that come from a conventional seed source if your organic seed is not available. But this must be documented. So what do organic farmers use instead of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides? Well, as I mentioned, soil fertility and quality are the most important practice for optimum organic production. Crop rotations are required, and not just corn followed by soy and back to corn, minimum of 3 crops. And most organic farmers have, I would say, 4-year rotation is the average here in Iowa. So you can use compost, you can use manure, and you can use cover crops that contain legumes, the nitrogen fixing plants. That's the most common combination for organic grain crops. And then you can use lime that's naturally mined, because you want to strive for that neutral pH of 6.5 to 7.0. So the goal is to have maximum nitrogen fixation from your cover crops and your crops in the rotation. And then if you need to apply natural nitrogen-based amendments like manure and compost, you apply them at low rates that would limit runoff, leaching, and volatilization, so you don't have any nitrogen pollution. And here's some examples of compost that's made from swine, cattle, or poultry manure mixed with hay or straw. And if you make your own compost on your farm, that's the best way to do it, because then you're recycling nutrients right there on your farm. So crop rotations are required, I mentioned, and they help build soil structure and fertility. They add organic matter with those cover crops and nitrogen fixing crops like legumes. So the same crop cannot be grown in the same area every year, excuse me. So corn on corn would not be allowed in organic. So the reason for that is to build fertility, but also to interrupt insect, weed, and disease cycles, because when you switch your crop, the pests aren't able to find your hosts when they're switched. Cover crops can be plowed down, that's the most typical, but they also can be rolled in organic no-till, and every once in a while you'll hear about somebody experimenting with strip till, which is a little more difficult than organic, but it can be done. So most of the soil building crops that are required in the rotation serve as dual crops. That is, they can be harvested for grain and grazed or baled, such as the wheat and red clover mix here. It's actually crimson clover. But they have a big role in building soil fertility in your crop rotation. And these are some typical grain-based rotations in Iowa and the Midwest: corn, soybean, oat, alfalfa. Or the 4-year rotation I talked about is more common, with having alfalfa for the 4th year. Also corn, soybean, oat, red clover, or corn, soybean, winter wheat, and then frost seeding red clover. Another one that's rare, but I've seen this, is corn, buckwheat, soybean, with field peas planted in the spring to provide some nitrogen for that corn crop. As I mentioned, we have research ongoing at the ISU Neely Kenyon site farm, which has the LTAR site, the long-term agroecological research site. And we're now in 23 years comparing conventional and organic crops, originally supported by the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. And each plot is 1/4 of an acre, so we can take real size farm equipment through the plots. And the farmers are involved in developing this design, and they also help evaluate the results every year. So there's 44 plots with 4 crop rotations, 5 crops total across the rotations. It's a completely randomized design because we have equivalent slope and soil types. As I mentioned, we use a 30-foot border between every plot. The borders can be hayed, but the hay cannot be sold as organic, because that may be a conventional plot there. It's completely randomized. That could be an organic one there. We were certified organic in the 3rd year of production by Iowa's public agency, IDALS, Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. But there are other certifiers operating in Iowa that you could use too. If you want to have more details about the LTAR, you can Google LTAR Leopold Center, and they have a really nice brochure that they made for this project. So just to walk through some of the practices we use there in the LTAR organic corn fertility regime, the corn follows oats, alfalfa in the rotation, but in addition to the nitrogen fixed by the alfalfa, we do put 4 tons per acre of chicken manure, and that's really only put on every 3rd or 4th year of rotation, right before the corn year. And that provides between 80 to 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. It varies because of the different batches of that composted manure. It's treated as raw manure. We don't, even though it's composted somewhat, we put it on as raw manure according to the rules. And we put it on in generally March, end of March, when the soil is beginning to warm up. In the beginning years, we used this hoop house compost, which was fantastic, mixture of straw and hay manure from a swine operation, but that went away. So now we use poultry manure, and you can get it from a conventional farm that's allowed in the US with an analysis of 2,3,4 NPK. So we do watch our phosphorus. So far, it hasn't been an issue. The alfalfa and the rotation will help manage if you have higher levels of phosphorus from your manure. Weed management is very critical in organic in order to mitigate risks. So you have to have the equipment to do these weed management practices. Of course, you begin with preventive practices like cover crops, especially rye, which has this allelopathic property that helps mitigate weed seed germination and growth. Crop rotations can help with weed management. But tillage is the most common method of control. And I mentioned earlier about timeliness. This is where it really is important that you manage your weeds when they're first emerging. That's called the white thread stage. And at appropriate intervals to prevent weed seed establishment. So the first operation on our farm is this rotary hoe. And then we might run again a rotary hoe and eventually do a row cultivator. And you try to do as little as possible, averaging about 2 to 3 passes per year. A lot of organic farmers do ridge tilling, where they use this buffalo cultivator, a buffalo planter, and a buffalo cultivator, where it makes the ridges as it throws soil into the row. And this is, I haven't done the research, but they claim it's better for soil quality because they're only scraping a smaller surface of the row when they go to plant, which makes sense that it would have higher soil quality. Some folks are using flamers and a flame weeder, which shown here, it causes the water in the weed plant to heat up and die. It doesn't burn them, but if you have any dry matter out there, you could catch your field on fire. So you do have to use caution when using the flame weeder. Just to do a snapshot of our weed management in our L-tiller soybeans, we use, of course, preventive measures like the crop rotations, that allelopathic crop of rye after the corn. We plant at a high population rate, 175 to 220,000 seeds per acre. That's the range I've seen organic farmers use. Timely cultivation, as I mentioned. Propane flame burner if there's wet fields. That's the benefit of the flame weeder. You could take it out when the fields are too wet to cultivate. But then at the end, you may need to walk your soybeans, especially for any staining weeds like nightshades. And remember that solid cover of the small grain crop, the rye and the oats and the alfalfa are really important in your crop rotation for weed management. What about insects? Well, we've only had to spray an organic compliant insecticide once in 23 years. So that tells you that insects are not a big risk on organic farms. And that's because we have biodiversity. We conserve our beneficial insects because we're not using any toxic insecticides. A lot of benefit comes from resistant varieties. For example, the soybean aphid resistant variety really made a difference with organic production when that variety came out, and it's used a lot now on organic farms. But as I mentioned, there are low toxicity organic compliant pesticides that can be used, such as that garlic barrier shown there. But please check with your certifier before you put anything on in case there's any inert ingredients that would violate the organic rules. But in general, your organic farm is going to be full of beneficial insects shown here. And I know in orchard systems, for example, diversifying your orchard with cover crops, shown in the middle there, bell beans, really helps bring in beneficial insects. So what kind of yields have we been getting when we use all these practices? Pretty good yields. The yields in the organic system, shown here, the 3-year rotation, the 4-year rotation, have been equivalent to the conventional corn soybean. So no statistical difference, although you can see you get a numerical bump when you have that extra year of alfalfa. So that's why we push for 4-year rotation if you can do it. Now, the transition years are considered the riskiest years for organic production because you're moving from synthetic nitrogen to compost, slow release nitrogen. But we saw no overall yield decrease during the transition years, except when we switched from a yellow dent corn variety to a white corn variety, and we did have lower yields that year. When we went back to the yellow dent, we had the same yields, no significant difference with the conventional. And just to show you the difference of weather, how much weather impacts yields, I know you all know this, but in the recent years, we've seen so much climate change with really wet springs, cold, wet springs, and droughts every summer. And I have to look back at this data to make me remember that we used to have really perfect weather here, where we had timely rains and it wasn't excessively wet in the summer and no droughts. And when we had that kind of weather, we could obtain up to 200, in this case, 202 bushels an acre organic corn. So we actually had a significantly higher yield in 2005 compared to the conventional. So it can be done if we ever return to normal weather. Soybeans fix their own nitrogen, so we've never seen a difference in yield between conventional and organic systems. About 50 bushels per acre in the organic and 49 in the conventional. Oats averaging about 102 bushels an acre, not really seeing a lot of difference if we put in that extra year alfalfa that's related to the oat yields, but maybe a slight numeric bump when you have 4-year rotation. Wheat averaging about 50 bushels an acre. You can see the variability based on the weather because wheat does not like wet springs. It tends to bring in disease. So wherever it was a wet spring, we had a reduction in yield, but our average was 50, which beat the county average there in Adair County. The problem with small grains, I alluded to this earlier, is they are wonderful for soil health. They have deep roots and the tillering helps prevent weeds. So they're an essential part of your crop rotation, your organic system plan. And the further north you go, the higher yields you're gonna have. But here in Iowa, we still have a lot of leaf diseases, rust, we have leaf rust in oats, and that decreases photosynthetic capacity and leads to a yield decrease. You can have vomitoxin in times of high rains, which would affect the quality of the grain. Overall, the feed market is much easier to meet than the qualifications for the food grade market. But there are a lot of organic farmers that do meet the food grade market for organic oats. I'll talk about that in a minute. But when you go for the food grade, you're going to have other things besides weight that you're going to have to consider, such as with wheat, falling number, and other factors. I'll talk about that in a second. Alfalfa has been really productive out there when it rains. In 2012, you guys remember that year, that horrible year where we only had less than a ton an acre of alfalfa compared to our average, 4 tons per acre. What about weeds? Well, if you use all those practices we described earlier with the preventative practices and timely weed management, your weeds can be statistically similar between conventional and organic. Of course, when you're using herbicides, they're always going to be lower, but there's no statistical difference. But if you don't use those practices, including timely weed management, your weeds can get ahead of you, as shown in this slide here. So you don't want that to happen. That is a big risk in organic production, staying on top of the weeds. The beauty about organic, as is shown in these coming slides from Dr. Cynthia Camberdella from USDA ARS in Ames, Iowa, she measured soil quality at the LTAR for 20 years, and she showed consistently higher carbon sequestration in the organic plots compared to the conventional. And that higher carbon improves your soil in general and will lead to higher yields overall. She also showed higher total nitrogen in the soil, which is the nitrogen stored for the next crop. And that was greater in the organic compared to the conventional plots. Beneficial soil microbial populations were always greater in the organic plots compared to the conventional. And these are really critical, as I mentioned, to help recycle your nutrients, break down your plant residue and recycle it as nutrients for the next crop. So you want to have these beneficial soil microorganisms growing in your organic system. pH, Cindy observed that the pH actually became less acidic in the organic system, and she attributes it to the use of this acidic synthetic fertilizer in the conventional system. Aggregate stability, which relates to the size and pores of in your soil, which helps with water infiltration, was greater in the longest rotation. The organic rotation had 2 years of alfalfa. She didn't find significant difference between the conventional and organic 3-year rotation and the conventional rotation, but saw a significant difference when you had the 2nd year of alfalfa. So her summary was, despite serious droughts, organic management systems were resilient and continued to supply nutrients to the crops. And that's critical in risk management. Now turning to some of Dr. Chase's numbers, because how does this translate into dollars, which a lot of people want to know about. So looking at the returns from 2014 to 2018, you can see right off the bat in the organic system, which is a 4-year organic system, the returns to management were about $441 compared to negative returns in the conventional. And that's from 2014 to 2018. Just in 2018, $385 in the organic versus negative $51.52 in the conventional. Now, the returns are based on both the premium price and the costs of production. So what did Dr. Chase find in the cost of production? On average, the costs of production were about $100 less in the organic, even during the transition, because you're using no synthetic fertilizers or pesticides. So looking at the costs, $534, $535 in the conventional versus $429 in the organic. So that's another benefit, is lowering your input costs. Leading Dr. Chase to conclude that the debate is over. Organic systems offer the classic economic risk-reward opportunity. Organic systems, if managed properly, are more profitable per acre on average than conventional farms in Iowa. And if your net farm income goal is $40,000 per year, an organic farmer can reach this goal with less than 200 acres versus 2,000 acres or more for the conventional corn soybean farm. Now let's look a little bit at marketing and storage. On-farm storage is essential for organic production, and also having flexibility in your marketing scheme. It's imperative that you keep your grain in good condition, and you can do primary grain cleaning right on your farm that will help improve the quality of the grain and decrease your costs later on, but you could also take it to a cleaner too. We'll talk about that in a minute. And Bob, who did these slides, says most important thing is get your paperwork in early and line up your buyer as soon as possible. So getting your organic certification paper in, as I mentioned, that's a once a year inspection. It's really critical to get those in so you can line up your inspection and have your paperwork ready when you're ready to sell in the fall. Also, it's important to look at where you want to market. So in the initial time for organic producers, there's a lot of effort that goes into determining markets compared to just taking it down the road to the local elevator. You can look at domestic markets or international markets. When I first moved here to Iowa, there were a lot of organic growers that were selling their organic soybeans directly to Japan. Because Japan and the European Union and Canada have equivalency agreements with the United States. So if it's certified organic here, it's acceptable in Japan. the EU and Canada. You have to make the determination if you're going for the food grade or the feed grade. We'll talk a little bit more about that. You can do individual, group, or merchandiser, cleaner, or processor. Make sure your purchaser is a licensed grain dealer. That is key in resolving issues later on if you have any. And know about the recourse in the case of late or failure to pay. If they're licensed, they are protected by an indemnity fund. Then you can also look into forward contracts versus spot market. It's important to know where will possession change on the farm, or is it the buyer's facility, and then who's paying for the freight. So all these questions are important to discuss with your buyer, and find your buyer before you're planting anything. There's several websites you can go to look at for information on buyers, like our ISU Organic Ag program has a list of buyers. Iowa Organic Association has a resource guide you can look at. Moses also, Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service, also has an organic resource list. So do your homework, talk to various buyers, lower your risk by knowing exactly what market you're getting into ahead of time. Also, what's really improved since I started here is now we have direct information on pricing. So the USDA Ag Marketing Service now puts out organic grain price reports. And you can see, for example, this was January 27th. Corn was averaging $6.95. Soybeans were averaging $19.24 a bushel. Just a couple slides on typical contract quality standards for corn and soybeans. Both of them, chickens drive the market. So soybeans are going to be looking at your protein, and that's really connected to your variety. So have a discussion with your buyer, also your seed salesperson, about what variety would be best to get the highest protein if that's what you're striving for. You want to get 60 pounds per bushel. If you're selling the food grade, they're going to ask you your seed size. So there's tofu seeds per pound and natto or smaller soybeans. That's a rare market now to go for, but there are still some contracts being let for those food grade soybeans. They want uniformity in color and shape if you're going into the food grade market, 12% moisture, and you will be tested to make sure your soybeans, a full sample, have no trans genes in them. For example, Roundup Ready genes. Corn, again, chickens driving the market. Moisture should be at 15%, 56 pounds per bushel. Be aware that you don't want to have any cracks or molds, especially if you're going into the food grade market. And again, you'll be tested for that you're free of transgenic proteins. Small grains, Bob likes to say it's in the groat. To determine if you're going for food or feed grade. As I mentioned, food is a lot higher. You want to have it 32 pounds per bushel at least to make the food grade market. Wheat is very specialized too for the food grade market. Hard red winter is used for the food market. You want 60 pounds per bushel, and you want it insect free. Of all the crops I mentioned, wheat can have issues in storage with insects. So there's an organic product called diatomaceous earth, DE, that some farmers mix in with their stored wheat to reduce the risk of contamination from, for example, the Indian meal moth that could get into your stored wheat. And what for us was a little difficult to achieve was that 12% protein for the food grade market. So if you can't make the food grade, there is a feed market for wheat. It's a good corn substitute used by cattle and poultry, and it's driven by high price corn prices. So if corn prices go up, wheat prices will go up too. And barley can also be fed to cattle and poultry. So contracts, more on contracts, it's the buyer's call for delivery. You're gonna have to send a sample. They'll have a loadout protocol where you'll have your bill of lading, your certified weight ticket, your clean truck affidavit that's required in organic to show that that load is totally organic and was cleaned out if any conventional product was carried ahead of it. And you also, as I mentioned, need your organic certificate. Cleaning protocols can be based on what your buyer wants, and that can determine your seed sizing. Clean out holes, splits, anything not whole grain. Payment, again, go with a licensed grain buyer to minimize your risk. 30-day maximum payout, and current market is actually quicker than that. Rejection options, if you do get rejected, sometimes there's alternative organic markets you can get into. I mentioned about going from food grade to feed grade, but you may need to be prepared that you may have to go into the conventional market too. So just know that can happen if they find any contamination in your grain. For specialty crops like blue corn, white corn, for example, they'll have their specific requirements on that. So bottom line, make sure you read the contract and understand it before you get into this. Last but not least, crop insurance. It's not wide scale with organic producers, but it may become more so with climate change. And thanks to Scott Schreiber for his slide here. He says that crop insurance can make a bad situation tolerable. I showed you his down corn from the derecho this year. He also suffered from drought. He gets multi-peril revenue protection, and his level of protection is 50 to 85% max. Actual production history, APH times the organic market price is guaranteed. Unit type is important. They use optional units. Contract option can raise the guarantee. And Scott advocates that you select an agent that specializes in organic crop insurance. And in Iowa, you get a cover crop discount of $5 per acre. He also gets hazard insurance for his building and equipment coverage, which really came into play this year with the derecho. So in conclusion, I hope I've shown you that you can manage risk in organic production, but it requires following organic practices to ensure ample fertility and moisture in your soils as that buffer against climate change like drought. And our organic research has shown greater soil organic quality, higher profitability, and equal yields. But the caveat is always using integrated weed management, cover crops, crop rotation, and timely, limited tillage operations. Crop insurance now is more amenable to organic than in the past. And so organic premium prices are now taken into account if you buy crop insurance for organic. I didn't talk about livestock. We do feel that livestock integration is essential in an organic system, either having animals themselves or using their manure. So all organic farmers are doing one or the other on their organic farm. And it seems that Iowa organic livestock producers have remained viable by using a mixture of local sales and wholesale to stay afloat, especially during trying times like the pandemic, where local sales have actually surged. So with that, Olivia, I'll turn it back to you and see if there's any questions out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for joining us. For anyone who does have questions, please drop those in the chat box now, and Kathleen will hang around a little bit just to make sure we can get all those answered.
Kathleen, while we're waiting for the questions to pop in the chat, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the crop insurance. I know that's been a little bit of a limiting factor in the past in terms of organic production. And I'm just wondering if it's, become obviously, hopefully much more widespread now and common.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Krista, it is, because when I first started here, there wasn't even organic insurance for organic producers. So I'll go back to that. And not to brag, but our research had a lot to do with this organic market price. We were contacted by USDA Risk Management Agency to help them put together a portfolio for organic producers, and we show them our data on our yields. And I think they use them in their determination of how to come up with this guaranteed price for organic producers that would take in the certified organic premium price for the first time ever. So I think a lot of more people became interested then that they would actually reap organic premium prices instead of conventional prices, which was the norm when I first started here, if you bought crop insurance for organic production.
All right, Kathleen, I'm not seeing anyone else with questions here in the chat box. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you to the listeners who joined us as well. And we hope you enjoyed this webinar as well as the rest of the series.
Thank you very much.